Hello, good evening, viewers. I am live with Dr. Colin Ross. We are talking about mind control, the CIA's darkest secret, MK Ultra. I know the viewers have had a fascination with this subject ever since we had O'Neill on. Recently, we had Kathy O'Brien on. We had Anna Lee. Survivors, we've got some more survivors lined up to come on as well. And when I first heard about MK Ultra, when I read about it in the book, I was like, no way is this possible. This must be absolutely baloney. How could our own government possibly do such experiments on us? But lo and behold, it's all declassified now. It's got its own Wikipedia page. More and more information is coming out. But Dr. Colin Ross is certainly an expert on this. I've watched several of his interviews, and we're in for a fascinating evening ahead of us. And Dr. Colin Ross's links are in the description box. We have got the website, etc. And we've got some links as well to our previous MK Ultra guests. So put your questions in the chat, folks. We'll get them ready. And huge thank you for coming on, Colin. We really appreciate you spending time with us.
My pleasure.
Let's not start out like all the other interviews I've done with MK Ultra, where we just define it. What I'd like to do is we'll get to that, but I'd like to grip the viewers with a very compelling story you told about a young girl whose own father was committing horrible acts towards her, and he put her into the program. Do you remember that story that you told in one of your interviews? You said you gave a bare bones version, but we'd like a detailed version.
Sure. Well, so there's the documented stuff, and then there's the stuff that's not documented, right? So not documented does not mean it didn't happen, obviously. So in my book, The CIA Doctors, I made a conscious decision. I'm just sticking with documented facts because I didn't want to be open to conspiracy theory attacks. But of course, all the deepest, darkest stuff is still classified and buried. And then there's stuff that's sort of kind of at the surface or near the surface. So the stories that I've heard from patients are kind of in that category, except for one person who was fully documented.
And is that the story that we can elaborate on then?
Sure. So it's not. So the conspiracy theory sounding stuff, which I've heard many times, is when I was a little girl. Almost all girls that I've spoken to, when I was a little girl, I was put into some kind of special education thing, advanced learning thing, experimental class, after school program. It was sometimes on a military base, sometimes at the school. And it all seemed kind of above board, but then the person got gradually recruited in all these experiments. And then you can't tell for sure, do the parents know what was going on, or generally didn't know. And another category of stories is my dad was an incest perpetrator on me, and he basically contracted me out or sold me into the program directly. And then the third variation is my family was in usually a satanic cult, some kind of cult organization. They were already doing all kinds of gory stuff. And the idea there seems to be that if you get kids who've had huge ritual abuse, they're already fragmented, dissociated. And so then you just already got the building blocks in place, and then you can modify that up to a controlled Manchurian candidate. So those are sort of the categories of stories.
So the girl whose own family were doing those horrible things to her then, what was her story?
It was in the category of sent off to sort of enrichment, gifted child program, and then sort of shifted over to the base. And then on the military base, I'm trying to think. I've had a few people name specific bases, but usually, you're just a kid, you don't even know the name of the base. And then there's like 5 to 10, maybe 15 kids in the program. And the experiments included the whole range of stuff. So there'd be LSD, other drugs, hallucinogens, sitting at a computer, enforced practicing of different things, learning skills on the computer. The one girl that I'm thinking of now, who now is a woman, her dad was in a satanic cult, was a in the home incest perpetrator, and his motivations seemed to be scoring points with the big guys, getting in with the big guys, and who knows exactly what the payoff to him was. He ended up drinking himself to death, literally, and was involved in organized crime, on the edge of crazy stuff, on the edge of JFK assassination, because he knew some of the characters in that story. And all of that was corroborated by her mother and her sister. So a bunch of it was corroborated, but she was taken to the base. There's the things that I heard include being spun around on equipment, having EEGs on you, forced memorization tasks, scary stuff, either on film or like dog attacks and so on, which is the same as we hear about Abu Ghraib. Right? At Abu Ghraib, the so-called whistleblowers, I'd like to know how that exactly was organized, because that's like a highly secure space. So you don't just go in there with a camera, take some pictures, walk out, get them developed. So that's suspicious, who's in charge of that, the program itself, and then who was in charge of leaking it out and what was their motive. But in those Abu Ghraib pictures where they're clearly doing mind control, enhanced interrogation, mind control, it's the same thing. That would include sexual humiliation, insulting, tearing up the Quran in front of you, being stripped naked and forced to do sexual acts with other prisoners, with female American military people watching, electroshocks, food deprivation, sleep deprivation, like everything you can imagine. And it's the same in these Manchurian Candidate child mind control programs. It's kind of everything you can throw at the wall sort of approach. And then creating alter personalities on purpose. And there's this guy, G.H. Estabrooks, who was actually born in Canada, but he spent his career at Colgate College in upstate New York. And I have documents. So my research assistant went up to Colgate, went to the library. There's all his papers there, got copies. He was like highly connected guy. So he corresponded, all of this is in documents that I have, corresponded back and forth with J. Edgar Hoover for 3 decades. J. Edgar Hoover's second in command, came out to Colgate College, attended conferences that he put on. He, George Estabrook, was a hypnosis expert, communicated with, was at the same conferences as Jolly West, Martin Orne, 2 MK Ultra top secret cleared contractors. So there's this whole network of connections, all documented, all clearly established. And this guy from Colgate College, Estabrooks, he presented at military conferences on the topic of either the super spy, which is a Manchurian Candidate, or military uses of hypnosis. And then he had military people come to Colgate to attend conferences. There's a whole network of people. And the super spy, which he published descriptions in 42 or 3 in his textbook, and then as late as 73 in a magazine, basically, detailed description of he recruits a susceptible military guy. It doesn't really define what susceptible means, but then over a period of months, he would do not exactly described conditioning experiments. he would create a new alter personality for which the front guy had a full amnesia, didn't know it existed. And he would insert a hypnotically programmed word or phrase. In the example he described, it's "the moon is clear." So he would bring the guy in the US, have an interview, he gets an assignment of some kind, and then the moon is clear. Out comes the created alter personality. He's given whatever the real information is, flip back to his regular self, goes on a military aircraft over to Japan, is talking to the colonel over there. Hello, 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 hello. The moon is clear. Out comes the Manchurian candidate personality who delivers the information. Response is inserted back to the US. So he describes those people in that much detail, and they do courier infiltration and penetration operations. So that's what he describes. He doesn't describe assassination assignments, but in the MK Ultra documents and Bluebird and Artichoke, which are programs before MK Ultra in the 1950-54 timeframe, in great detail they describe women as young as 19 who are like secretaries or office personnel, and they hypnotize them, get them to deliver documents or go to a location, retrieve documents. And in one experiment, the guy's handed a gun. He believes that it's loaded. He pulls the trigger, but there's no bullet. And he believes he's just shot the military target, so to speak. So all of this in great detail, explicit. You don't have to read between the lines. So that's the tip of the iceberg, but that's what's documented.
So we've interviewed several people who've been incarcerated with SIRHAN. And SIRHAN, he doesn't remember what happened, so he couldn't show remorse, so they couldn't let him out. Catch-22.
Right.
And the people that that we have interviewed have lived with this guy and spoke to him, and they're convinced that this guy's mind was just completely gone when this happened, the assassination. Would you say that SIRHAN fits into the categorizations you're describing?
Yeah, so he's a chapter in my book of CIA doctors, and he's in the category of looks like it but can't absolutely prove it. So he had contact with a lead hypnosis expert. That part's documented for sure. Prior to the shooting, he was involved with Rosicrucians, I think it was, and did some sort of mind developments. Who knows exactly what training with them? So there's circumstantial evidence that he was controlled and managed by somebody. Then at the actual shooting, the shooting takes place, but just immediately before, he goes into a room where there's some kind of lights, and that's when he blanks out. And he sees it's in all the assassination literature, the woman in the polka dot dress. So there's a woman in a polka dot dress who comes up, talks to him. So she seems to be some sort of handler, programmer person. And then the most important, the most interesting thing is in one of the books, I think it's called RFK Must Die, I think is the title of the book. Very well documented, researched. There's photographs of the Los Angeles County coroner, who's a very nationally known guy, and he's there measuring the bullet entry holes. And it turns out that the total number of entry holes in Bobby Kennedy himself, bystander who was hit, the walls, and the door jamb, there's more entry holes than there are chambers in Sirhan's gun. And if you just go to YouTube, you can watch. He's 4 or 5-ish feet in front of Kennedy. But the autopsy report says that the fatal wound was from inches or less immediately behind his head. And those are the documented facts. So Sirhan may have actually shot him, may not have, but it's not a single lone gunman sort of operation. for sure.
What about the peculiar history of Ted Kaczynski?
He's an interesting character too. So he was like a really bright guy. So he got to Harvard when he was something like 16, I think it was. And he got drawn into what would now be called mind control brainwashing experiments, enhanced interrogation experiments. While he was an undergrad, I think it was about a year and a half, I forget the exact duration. And the guy who ran all those experiments, this is totally documented, um, but at the same time, there was a psychiatrist who was a documented top secret cleared MK Ultra LSD research contractor. So that guy apparently administered LSD. So he got mind control, advanced interrogation, brainwashing experiments for sure. And he was given LSD multiple times for sure. Those are the known facts. So it looks absolutely like he was controlled and handled.
And what was this like? He signed up for something, didn't he? Where they were degrading him.
Yeah, it was basically enhanced interrogation kind of protocol. They tearing him down, insulting him, demeaning him. You're nothing. You're a piece of this, piece of that, which is standard part of interrogations all around the world.
What got you interested in this subject? How did you first hear about MK Ultra?
I first heard. So I moved from Canada, where I grew up and did my psychiatry, in 1991, and I sort of was kind of aware that there's experiments in McGill because one of the victims of those experiments was the wife of a member of parliament from Winnipeg, where I was. So I could kind of like vaguely aware that some kind of stuff went on. Then when I got to within 3 months after getting to Texas, people started telling me stories. I was taken to a military base, this happened, that happened. And then one very sort of scared, overwhelmed woman said, "Here, take these documents. I don't want them anymore." And those were some MK Ultra documents. Uh, so then I thought, oh, okay, I'm going to look into this. I read a couple of books that are already published. Um, and there was a little bit, there was nothing online because the internet didn't exist yet. So I had to go to the library, do my own research. And then I would get a reference, and then from the 50s to the 60s. And then I would go to the library, get that reference, get the reference list for that reference, go to those. So it's a whole, tracking published articles, some of which are very amazing. You would think that they would all be classified and not talked about. So that's how I got into it. And I originally was not particularly into conspiracy theory or government or politics, but I thought, okay, I'm going to look into this. And so then I contacted the CIA, which is pretty easy to do. Now you can get all these documents digitally without having to go anywhere. But back then, I was at a conference in '92 in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and I had prearranged to go to a CIA reading room and look at all the MK Ultra documents. So, and then you're allowed to buy them. It was 10 cents a page for 15,000 pages back in '91. So I hop in the taxi at the conference hotel, and imagine the paranoia this could generate. So the taxi driver on the way says, "Oh, would you like to go through the grounds of the Pentagon? It's on the way." Yeah, okay. So we go through the grounds of the Pentagon. And then he explains that he was a policeman in Afghanistan before he came to the United States. And at which point I'm like, ooh, what's going on here? And then he says, he dropped me off at the address, which there was no signage. He didn't tell you what the building was. And he says, "What is that?" "No, I'm just going to read some documents." So I kind of didn't want to give him too much info. And I walk in there, and it's a not really large room. There's all kinds of military people, and there's a sign that says there's two telephones on the wall: secure line DIA only, secure line CIA only. So I go up to the desk and say, "Hi, I'm here to read some documents." And the guy just gives me the look. Oh, yeah, here's one of these liberal whistleblower guys. Okay, sit over there. And the woman comes down and says, oh, hi. We hop in the elevator, which was pretty crowded, whole bunch of guys in uniform. I'm acting really cool. So we go up to whatever it was, fifth or sixth floor. We go down the corridor, and there's like the keypad, and you enter into secure space. And then you go through another door, another keypad, and there's a receptionist in there. Hi, sign in. And then you go sort of left down the corridor. Then you got to go through another keypad secure door to get to the room where the documents are, but they're not there yet. So the woman goes and gets them and wheels them in a little roller thing. But the door of the room where I actually read the documents was open the whole time into the corridor where I could just go to the elevator and go out into the public. So there's this whole sort of performance of secure space. And then in the middle of the day, and they had a woman who's probably late 70s or early 80s sit with me all day. In the middle of the day, she goes, well, what are those documents you're reading? So they're a bunch of documents that were declassified in the 70s. She goes, well, what do they need me here for then? I don't know. And that was our entire conversation in like 6 hours of looking through documents. But in the middle of the day, she had to go to the restroom, aka the washroom, the bathroom. And so there's two construction guys out in the hall, civilian construction guys, doing some repair down the hall. And she goes to them, hey, could you watch this guy while I go to the bathroom? And they go like, oh yeah, we can watch him. So I'm sitting there with these classified documents that were actually all declassified in the 70s. They're all in the public domain, under surveillance by two black construction guys who think it's a joke. That was my experience. So that made me think, I wonder if this is kind of a government bureaucracy that's not all that well run. And then I got all the documents and read them all. And then going to the library, searching the papers, that's how I got all the foundation of the book I wrote.
Reading those documents, what were the most surprising revelations for you?
Well, like those G.H. Esterbrook's, I knew it was him because I could piece it together. He pitched his Manchurian Candidate program to the CIA in the early 50s. So that was kind of, oh, I can actually document all this stuff. There was LSD experiments, so everybody knows what LSD is. I watched a movie called Jacob's Ladder, which is 60s, I think, probably. And the basic plot is it starts off with these American combat guys in the jungle of Vietnam. There's all kinds of gunfire. And one guy is just like out of it, not doing anything. And then there's a chemist who's one of the characters in the movie. And then there's the protagonist. And the chemist is explaining to the protagonist later on that the drug involved was BZ. BZ, I've never heard of that. So lo and behold, in the documents, I find, oh, BZ. And I've got a whole file on BZ. And it's like a super LSD where you stay on the trip for like 24 to 48 hours. And then in one of the other projects called Project Often, it describes guys being on trips even longer than 24, 48 hours. So LSD was actually kind of like the mild version of all the hallucinogens they gave. And then it's just, there's another document that was 1975, 6, somewhere in there. General Counsel for the U.S. Army is testifying at one of the Senate committee hearings. And he provided a document listing around about, I forget the exact number, but like around about 120 different substances that were tested by the U.S. Army. And lo and behold, there's BZ on the list. So the huge scale of it. So like in the LSD experiments, there might be like 1,500 guys who are all, quotes, volunteers, military guys. And there's video of all this on YouTube currently. But you take 500,000, 1,500 times over 100 compounds. It's an enormous number of people who got experimented on. So that was a little surprising to find out. And then a few people dying during experiments. That's all in the documents. In MK Ultra, there was projects on children. So this guy, G.H. Esterbrooks, he did projects, but they're not described. You don't know what he was doing. But they were at 2 orphanages in New York State. So he was creating Manchurian candidates in adult military volunteers, and he was doing something at orphanages. So there's sort of these tantalizing bits of information. So just the scale of it and the number of things they did was amazing. And then finding out that a lot of leading figures in psychiatry were themselves top secret cleared MK Ultra contractors. And the contracting entities included the American Psychological Association, which is not surprising because the 2 enhanced interrogation bosses, psychologists, recently have all been declassified, and they're psychologists, so that's the American Psychological Association. So organized psychiatry, psychology have been involved since the time the CIA was formed, which was 1947.
So you were talking about people who died during these experiments. Didn't one of the CIA's own jump out of a window?
Yeah, that's Mr. Olson. So that's also the topic of a book, all declassified. There's photographs. So the family was told it was a suicide, but actually there's several different books. So there's a guy named Pierre. So now I'm just illustrating how there's all these tantalizing connections between all kinds of things. So this guy, Pierre Lafitte, who's an existing guy, who has a whole list of different aliases. One of his aliases was, the last name was Heidel. And it looks over 95% for sure. He was in the hotel room when Olson was pushed out. It was, I think, the 10th floor. He died on the ground. And he was sort of a bridge CIA, US military, full-time career guy who's involved in chemical weapons development. And he went to get together sort of in a slightly remote area outside DC, where the head of MK Ultra was there, and he and several other guys were given LSD without their knowing. And then he had sort of a paranoid reaction to that over a period of days. CIA contractors went there and examined him and talked to him, and were in the room when he was pushed out the window by this Pierre Lafitte guy, because he was threatening to become a whistleblower. So obviously he had to be taken care of. So you hear that part of the story, okay, Pierre Lafitte, that's interesting. Well, one of his aliases was Heidel. Alex Heidel was Lee Harvey Oswald's alias. And Lee Harvey Oswald and this guy, Pierre Lafitte, both worked at the Riley Coffee Company in New Orleans in the early 1960s. So all these things, you can't prove what that means, but it's obviously way beyond coincidence. And so it takes you just into this sort of like you're on an acid trip yourself, looking at all these facts and strange connections, and some you can document and some are suspicious.
You touched on some of the operations. Could you describe the influences of the Nazis on US intelligence at its genesis and mind control?
Sure. Which obviously is not going to be anything in the interest of humanity. So, documented fact, there's doctors in the death camps doing all kinds of experiments, right? And there was mescaline experiments done in the camps because LSD wasn't yet available. LSD was accidentally discovered by a chemist in Sandow's laboratory in Switzerland in 42, 43. And he was studying ergo alkaloids, which are type of fungus that grows on rye wheat, and then modifying it. He got some on his finger, licked his finger. That was the world's first acid trip. But LSD wasn't like readily available at all until really the late 40s, early 50s. And the first side fact, first large-scale manufacturer and distributor of LSD in the United States was actually Eli Lilly Company, based on 2 contracts in the 50s, MK Ultra contracts, to provide a secure source of LSD because they were concerned that the Russians were going to buy it all from Sandoz Pharmaceutical. So that's kind of an ironical fact. And Eli Lilly, LSD works on the serotonin system in the brain. So Eli Lilly developed their expertise in serotonin physiology on contract to the CIA for LSD production. And they brought out the first SSRI antidepressant, Prozac, which works on serotonin. So for sure, the SSRI antidepressants are an outgrowth of LSD supply and manufacture. So it's just endless. There's example after example after example. Back to the Nazis. So they were doing experiments, did involve mescaline. They were tried at Nuremberg. And the group of professionals from Canada and the United States who went over and interrogated some of the detainees, the medical detainees at the Nuremberg trials, included the guy who was the head of the Department of Psychiatry at McGill, who he was at various times president of the Quebec Psychiatric Association, I think the Canadian Psychiatric Association, the Society of Biological Psychiatry, and was one of the founding fathers of the World Psychiatric Association, along with William Sargent, who was a lead mind control doctor in Great Britain, who was based at the Tavistock Institute. So this guy, Ewan Cameron, was part of the team that went over and interviewed the doctors who were doing things including mescaline hallucinogen experiments. Then he came back, and lo and behold, less than 10 years later, he's doing LSD experiments on Canadians on contract to the CIA, cleared at top secret. And then there's 2 other branches of the story. One is there's a guy named Albertus Strugold, who was a high-ranking Nazi guy. His experiments included pleasant experiments such as putting, this would be like a gypsy or some camp prisoner, some disposable guy, putting him in a chamber and suddenly dropping the air pressure in the chamber to the equivalent of 50,000 feet. And then, surprise, surprise, the guys would have like brain hemorrhages and die. And then he'd do autopsies on them. So, like full-on criminal Nazi death-causing experiments. So then he was brought over to the United States, was set up to be the head of aerospace medicine at one of the military bases in San Antonio, has a library named after him, and received an honor from, I think it's called the Daughters of the American Revolution, some sort of American organization. So how did he get, and how did people like him get over to the United States if they're documented war criminals who should have been executed after Nuremberg? Well, there's a series of programs, best known being Project Paperclip, where at the end of the war, so there's the Russians, the French, the British, and Americans, and they're all scrambling to get their hands on all these Nazi scientists and experts and all kinds of different things. And one of the people, so the trouble is a lot of these guys are war criminals, so they couldn't get visas to come into the United States because the State Department would say no. So they were routed around that process through Project Paperclip and brought into the United States. And one of the guys who came in through paperclip or related program was Werner von Braun, who was head of the NASA rocket program. And he was head of the V2 rocket program during the Second World War. And the labor for the V2 rocket program included a lot of prisoners at one of the Nazi prisoner camps, many of whom were worked to death. So fully documented Nazi war criminal. Oh, hi, welcome to the United States. We're so proud to have you here. We won't mention that little backstory.
So it seems that twins are of a special interest to the Nazi
Right.
experimenters. Did that transfer over to mind control and US or Western intelligence?
I don't actually know. I'm sure it did, but I don't actually know anything in particular about that. I can't remember the name of the documentary now, but there's an interesting documentary where it's a set of triplets, and I'll guarantee you that these guys were sucked into some sort of organized program. So they were normally you'd want to adopt them out. I can't remember what happened to their parents, but they were adopted into the system. You'd want to adopt them into the same family, right? But on purpose, as an experiment, one was sent to a high-income family, one to a middle-income family, and one to a low-income family. And none of them knew that they had two other brothers. And they sort of circumstantially, accidentally, one guy went to a college, and somebody came up to him and said, "Oh, hi, such and such a first name." He goes, "Well, that's not my name. My name is such and such." And so then the guy saying hi to him goes, "No, I knew you last year when you were here. I wasn't here last year." That's how he figured out that his brother was at the same school the year before. So then those two got together. And then by another circumstantial, they found the third guy. And then that's an organized program for sure. One of the brothers committed suicide. And in the documentary, this is all just sort of like an interesting backstory, but the military is not mentioned. But I'll guarantee you that some organized branch of intelligence was involved in that. So I'm sure there's troves of information about other twin experiments that were done, which are just all totally classified still. And
So
the other point is experts in ball bearings, jet propulsion fluids, lubricants, film, the whole range of scientific expertise were brought over, documented, admitted to. No psychiatrists mentioned. Medical doctors, but no psychiatrists. So that's a little piece of sleuthing that somebody needs to do to figure out, okay, who were the psychiatrists who came over under paperclip? And there's a series of those programs. Where were they housed? What was their influence on psychiatry?
some of the most shocking stories we hear are of the kids that were brought in, like the story at the beginning, where her own family were doing those horrific sexual things. And then, they bring the kids in and even more horrific sexual things are done to them. How can they possibly justify that? Is it they just say it's national security, we've got to have an edge, over the communists or something?
Exactly. So, and then the other explanation is they're just a whole bunch of offender weirdos themselves, right? So one of there's actually 2 or 3 MK Ultra sub-projects, and the overall umbrella was Operation Midnight Climax. So again, this is a stupid, ridiculous story. Can't possibly be true. Turns out fully documented. So mostly in San Francisco, but also in New York, the CIA set up safe houses, and they were like satin sheets and purple cloth, and it was like a Toulouse-Lautrec bordello. And they would get prostitutes to pick up guys, bring them back to the safe house, purely for scientific purposes. CIA guys would watch the whole thing through a two-way mirror, a one-way mirror, and document, because the prostitutes would slip the guys doses of LSD without their knowing. And in the documents, it says the purpose was to study the effect of hallucinogens under conditions that mimic an intelligence interrogation. Okay, so that kind of makes sense. They want to know what happens when you give somebody LSD and they don't know, and how do they react, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought that was the end of that story until I found, there's 15,000 pages of documents. It takes a while to go through them all. Here's a correspondence from one CIA officer to another CIA officer talking about the safe house in San Francisco. And he makes a comment that it's a lot of work to handle these Jekyll Hyde personalities. So who are the Jekyll Hyde personalities? Well, it's got to be the prostitutes, right? So part of the purpose of all the Operation Midnight Climax was to study the performance of mind-controlled prostitutes who were in their prostitute personality under conditions where the John couldn't possibly report to the police because he was stoned on LSD and didn't remember anything. So there's like, the first cover story is it didn't happen. Next cover story is, well, we were testing LSD. And then that actually is true, but it's a cover story for testing the Manchurian Candidate prostitute, I would say. Which I can't quite prove, but it's right on the edge of proof. This is part of a list of endless crazy things that were done.
So what was the scope of the people who were experimented on? Did it go from kids to adults, people in mental institutions, prisoners?
One of them was, there's so many names, I can't always remember every single one. But there's Georgetown Hospital in the Washington, D.C. area, and they recruited terminal cancer patients for experimentation in that program. Another one was Iona State Hospital in Michigan, where there's 4 or 5 psychiatrists, all of whom were previously military psychiatrists, and they were studying the use of a variety of different chemicals to interrogate people who were prisoners, and they were all imprisoned sex offenders who'd been found guilty of known things that they did. So they would interrogate them, give them a variety of different drugs to see which drug resulted in getting more confessions about things they'd never been charged with. So, and again, this is like the tip of the iceberg. This is what's been declassified.
What about US soldiers? Were they experimented on? Because I imagine with vaccines and drugs, and we saw the videos of them being exposed to the nuclear testing.
It's all just science fiction that could never possibly happen, except for the fact that it's fully documented. So LSD experiments, hypnosis experiments, interrogation experiments. At Tulane University, which is in the New Orleans area in Louisiana, there was, and I have the guy's published paper. This is what he's describing in public. Is there's a guy who suffers from the mental illness of homosexuality, because up until the early 70s, being gay was, according to the American Psychiatric Association diagnostic manuals, being gay was automatically a mental illness. The same as being transgender. Up until 2013, the official position of the American Psychiatric Association is being transgender is in and of itself a mental illness. Now they got politically correct and changed it to gender dysphoria. So this is not ancient history. So this guy who's a neurosurgeon was being helpful. He wanted to cure people of the disease of being homosexual. So in the published paper, he describes bringing in this, I think it was 19 at the time, a young gay guy. And what they did was they put electrodes in his brain, because he's an electrode brain implant experimenter. And they hooked up a sort of little pack that could be on his belt. And it was wired to the electrodes that are in his brain. So if he pushed the button on the little transmitter box, it would give his brain like sexual arousal, big positive stimulus. And so it turned out they had to take away the pack from him because he was pushing the button 1,500 times a day.
Woo.
So what they would do then is they would show him heterosexual pornography and stimulate his brain electrodes so that he'd be in a aroused pre-orgasmic state while being exposed to heterosexual pornography to see if they could convert him to straight. And then to test out whether that worked, they had a prostitute come in, all published in a mainstream psychiatric journal. They had a prostitute come in, have sex with him while he was wired up and they were monitoring his EEG. And then they debriefed the prostitute afterward. And she said, yeah, he functioned well, seemed to be a regular straight guy. So good, the experiment was a success. And then at the end of the paper, it says, well, then after discharge, he only relapsed once in the first 9 months.
Wow.
And this guy was a contractor to the CIA and several different branches of the military. And so the MK Ultra projects all are MK1, MK2, MK3. And when we look at the list of this guy, this psychiatrist, neurosurgeon's list of contracts, it's CIA, but it's not MK. It's some other set of programs that are still classified. So Sidney Gottlieb was the head of MK Ultra, and I talked to him on the phone way back in the 90s. He died since. And it was a funny conversation because, hi, I'm Colin Ross, I'm a psychiatrist, I'm doing background research on MK Ultra. And he kind of played it like, I'm not sure what that is. He says, okay, well, you were the head of MK Ultra. There's 149 sub-projects. So he finds out I know what I'm talking about. Says, oh, yeah. He says, so I'm interested in Martin Orne and Louis Jolly and West. He's like, I don't remember those names. So he kind of played it like he forgets, and it was a long time ago. But then we got into it, and he actually became more forthcoming. And then he just threw out a little comment. So, there's a whole nother unit besides mine, which has never been discussed in public, not documented. We don't know what the names of those programs were. But maybe it was the same set of programs as this contractor in New Orleans. So every time you ask a question, it's like a huge detour around this big map of different connections.
No, it's absolutely fascinating. I appreciate you giving us so much detail. We love to learn a lot from speaking to people like you, and tons of questions have come in. But yeah. I'm selfishly hogging you. I've still got a few of my own. What about institutional complicity then? Were the hospitals, universities, private doctors, were they manipulated or were they willing participants?
So MK Ultra, so there's multiple other projects besides MK Ultra. And Project Often was probably the most damaging one. That's where there was a couple of deaths documented. But just on MK Ultra, it's kind of there's 149 sub-projects. One third, roughly. 1/3 are cleared at top secret. They know it's CIA money. That's the story. Then there's another third is just sort of chemical procurement, industrial contracting type stuff. And then 1/3 is academics who are unwitting, which means they don't know that it's CIA money because it's filtered through what's called a cutout or a front organization. And one of those was the International Summer Villages, I think it was called, some name like that. So that was a children's camp in the northeastern United States. And it says in the documents, so it's just an ordinary academic guy who's studying, and he's not cleared. He doesn't know it's CIA money. He's just doing a project on how kids communicate when they don't share a language, because there's kids from all different countries brought over to this camp. So that's a lot of connections and financing and logistics going on there. But when you look in the CIA documents, it says, oh, the purpose of whatever the sub-project number was, the purpose of this project is to form relationships with young foreign nationals who may be of operational use to the organization in the future. So it's basically a recruitment thing. Martin Orne, was a big guy in the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, along with Jolly West, both of them top secret cleared MKUltra contractors. In his MKUltra subproject, it says that they're going to make him witting within about the next 4 or 5 months. So the terminology is witting or unwitting. And so they got access to all kinds of people for all kinds of purposes.
Wow. So Kathy O'Brien, we had Kathy on last week, and she was probably one of the first survivors I ever heard speak out. How did they let this get out into the public?
Well, that's a good question. Don't ask me. I don't know. So I've met her multiple times. She's a wonderful person. Seems to be in pretty good mental shape now. And the story is she was sucked into one of these programs, and exactly how she was either let go or slipped out or just got discontinued, that's a little unclear. And then this guy, Mark Phillips, who they lived together for a long time, who had some sort of former intelligence role that's not exactly clear, kind of befriended her and helped her escape from all the mind control aspects of it that were still running as an engine in her mind. So she doesn't think that he's anything other than a good guy. I also met him. Could very well be true. Could be he was a handler. Could be this was a deprogramming experiment. Could be that some of the story is pretty fantastic, like sort of like in the Pentagon or at the White House, or all these high-level politicians are using her for sex as part of this program. But that's perfectly possible. I mean, we know Jeffrey Epstein, right? We don't know the names of these people on this list that supposedly doesn't exist anymore. But it could be that it's setting up a fairly fantastic story that then is going to act as a credits cover story because ridiculous, that doesn't happen. And she's named a specific U.S. senator. So how can you name a senator and not get sued or killed? So it's all kind of puzzling. But she herself, she doesn't describe it in a fantastic, unbelievable fashion. It's perfectly believable. She's a sane, stable person, very pleasant, very likable.
We've had quite a few people have asked about whether MK Ultra techniques have been incorporated into the mass hypnosis of society today. And Shane has asked, do you believe MK Ultra still exists today in a modernized or rebranded form? And is it still fully active behind the scenes?
So my position on that is the CIA, U.S. military intelligence complex would be failing in their duties if they were not actively involved in this, minimally from a defensive perspective. Because there's got to be mind-controlled personnel being run at us by terrorist organizations, foreign governments. So, and then my other comment is, okay, so you volunteer, you're recruited, and instead of getting your leg blown off or half your brain blown out, you got some amnesia barriers from hypnosis. So if I was going to be on one of those two paths, I wouldn't mind just being hypnotized and having some amnesia, right? So from a military operational point of view, the damage caused by Manchurian candidate programs pales in comparison to getting blown up or killed, right? So, it's not a straightforward, simple sort of the good guys and the bad guys equation. But so my take on it is I'm not against the military or the intelligence communities. Obviously, we have to have some intelligence in military. Because I grew up in Canada. Without the U.S. military, I probably would have been in Gulag when I was 15 years old. So My focus on it is medical ethics. It's not medically ethical to create on purpose a mental disorder, multiple personalities, for military purposes when you're supposed to be treating mental disorders. And none of these psychiatrists, psychologists got informed consent. The families weren't notified. There was no independent legal counsel. It's complete violation of all professional ethics and standards. To me, that's the attack point that I'm interested in.
What do you think about the contemporary definitions of MPD and schizophrenia and the prescribed, what mainstream medical prescribes for them?
Did you say you have another 5 hours? So I've written one of my books, you might gather from the titles. One of my books is autobiographical, but it's also attack on psychiatry, called The Great Psychiatry Scam. Another academic book from the 90s is Pseudoscience in Biological Psychiatry. So I've been writing very critically of organized psychiatry. Actually, the first time was in medical student newspaper in the 70s. So 70s, 80s, 90s, aughts, 10s, that's quite a few decades I've been writing now and haven't been assassinated yet. And that's what, for real, that's a good thing about living in the United States because, psychiatrists don't get assassinated routinely for saying things in public. So there is actually freedom of speech. If you're a politician or people obviously are getting assassinated, but I'm glad I don't live in or didn't grow up in the Soviet Union because I never would survive. Um, so, so tell me your question again. Sorry, I lost the train of thought.
So what I'm getting at here is the origins and definitions of MPD and schizophrenia, and probably the role of trauma in those conditions.
Okay, so I've published 290 and something peer-reviewed papers in medical journals and a whole series of books about dissociative disorders. So I often have more than one or two words to say on the topic. So you have to have some sort of diagnostic system in psychiatry, which is none of the diagnoses are based on brain scans, blood tests, genetic tests. It's all observed behavior and things reported by the person. So symptoms. And in medicine, if you observe something like a broken bone, that's a sign. A symptom is a subjective complaint or description. So psychiatry is like 98% symptoms and a little bit signs. Like if the person's catatonic, that's kind of objective observation. So to me, psychiatry used to be dominated by Freudian psychiatry. So all the heads of, in the United States, all the heads of academic departments were like card-carrying, full-on psychoanalysts up into the 50s at least. Now they're all biological psychiatry, genes, brain chemicals, scans, drugs. And big pharma has like completely got control of all of this. And they're also control of the National Institute of Mental Health and all the research funding and on and on and on and on. So the whole model has shifted over away from Freud over to biology of the brain and the genes and the chemicals. And so it's in a disease model of mental disorders. But if you get somebody on camera, they're going to say, oh, we all know that there's psychological and social factors. It's called the biopsychosocial model. So there's plausible denials built into the system. But if you look at the funding of the National Institute of Mental Health, only 10% is on clinical topics at all. All the rest is on biological research. So I think that the profession is way off the deep end, wasting literally tens and tens of billions of dollars on chasing brain chemicals and genetic causes. And we already know, or we should know, it's right there in the published literature, that it's futile. We're never going to find something in genetics that's the least bit relevant to anything except some minute, like 1% of cases. Why do I say that? So there's a thing called genome-wide association studies, which are I admire the guys in terms of grant hustling, logistics, and organization, because they'll have literally 30,000 people with schizophrenia and 30,000 controls without schizophrenia. They'll draw their blood, scan their DNA of all these people, and then they'll find out, okay, there's one little slight variation at this location that's more frequent in the people with schizophrenia than the people without. And then they'll find like 5 or 10 of those, or sometimes they'll find a couple hundred, and they'll go, oh, well, we're really getting down to the core biology of schizophrenia here. But one publication, so this gets to be on the mainstream news, published in the top journals, interviewed by all these high up interviewers. We're digging down to the core biology, and that's going to lead to cures and treatment. Maybe not 5 minutes from now, but maybe next year, within 5 years, within 10 years. So it's always the marketing hype. So in this one particular study, there's 4 variations on the complement gene, which is part of the blood clotting cascade. And for 3 of the 4 variants, genetic variants at this specific site, there was no difference between schizophrenia and controls. So 1 out of the 4, they found that the rate of schizophrenia was 1.2% instead of 2% in the people who had this genetic variation. So that's so minute. What is that possibly going to lead to? Why did they have to have 30,000 people? Because if they only do 1,000 people in each group, they don't find anything of statistical significance. So they got to have these huge numbers of people. And then what they find is, from one study, it's this variation, this variation, this variation. Okay, great.